ask that question to sir.
You should be able to read it, right?
Yes, I'm able to read, sir.
Then you can pose that question to me.
Yes. If someone is writing that question, I will ask that question to sir. Yes,
Perfect.
sir. Yes.
Okay, well, this is the first slide of my presentation, and I usually put it here because the Shrikunj, it's okay to start, right?
Absolutely, sir. You can proceed, sir.
Okay, so I am doing my practices mainly shoulder and upper limb, and this poor polio patient came to me, and I was like completely flummoxed as to why is he coming to me? So I asked him, "Ke bhai, you have polio of both your lower limbs, and how can I help you?" And he said, "Well, I may have polio on my lower limbs, but I am walking on my hands, so my shoulders hurt." Right? So there are various ways your shoulder patient is going to present to you in your outpatient. So this is just a slide to show you how bizarre the patients can come into your clinic. So what I would like to say is that prior to examination, you must have a detailed history. A history guides your clinical examination. Okay, and usually diagnosis by history and your further just by history is 50% of the times it's clear what the patient is suffering from, and then with your clinical examination you should come to at least number 1, 2 and 3 kind of a differential diagnosis, and all your investigations that you're going to order are going to support or substantiate your clinical findings. I think that sort of thing is lost in today's day and age, where people come, patients sit in your clinic, and then they put a pile of investigations in front of you, and you tend to look at them before you even look at the patient. So I think we must desist that, and I think we train all residents to do that. But I think once you get into clinical practice, that sort of a sequence is lost. So I think you must make sure that all investigations that you order or the patient comes, it must substantiate your clinical findings rather than lead you to a clinical diagnosis. So first of all, ask a detailed history. That will guide you to your examination. So if you are looking at your history suggestive of a rotator cuff tear, then we do not necessarily do tests for recurrent dislocations, because that's not the pathology. So that is how your history should guide you to. You may look at it, you may inquire about the fact that whether there are any dislocations or not, but it is the history that guides your clinical examination. So in general, when you say shoulder examination, we basically mean the shoulder girdle, and that includes the glenohumeral joint, the sternoclavicular, the acromioclavicular, the scapula at the back, along with the scapulothoracic articulation. Once you do that, you must examine the opposite side as well, or you can do it simultaneously to see the difference between the normal and the abnormal side. Or if the patient has bilateral pathologies, then you can know the amount of involvement on both the sides. As always, you must look at the areas around it, and the cervical spine is a very integral part. You must make sure that you are not missing something. A lot of times cervical pathologies will coexist with your shoulder. Sometimes you have to distinguish one from the other. You must also look at eventually the nerves, the brachial plexus, and then if needed, individual nerves can be also checked and examined. Also, don't forget to examine the elbow, wrist and hand, because sometimes it is the other joints which will also guide you to a pathology that's happening in your shoulder, especially in situations like inflammatory arthropathy, etc. So it's important that you don't just do the shoulder, but take a look at the entire upper extremity as a whole. So again, we continue with this sequence. Again, this is not actually a part of clinical practice, but we would follow this sequence of inspection, palpation, range of motion, and various special tests that would depend on the specific pathology that you are suspecting. So what are these pathologies that we are normally looking at? So they are basically traumatic. Again, very few, there is very little examination in acute trauma. However, in chronic trauma or sequelae, then you still can follow the same sequence. But in non-traumatic situations, one of the most common pathologies that would come into a shoulder clinic is related to the rotator cuff and the subacromial impingement. You can have frozen shoulder, which obviously is probably one of the most common pathologies as well. Patients will come to you with arthritis. This could be of the glenohumeral joint. Even the acromioclavicular joint is a synovial joint and is quite frequently affected with arthritis. And unusually, but not very rarely, even the sternoclavicular joint can get arthritis. So when you look at arthritis, you must sort of look at this whole spectrum of these three joints. They can come to you with instability, which could be anterior, anteroinferior, posterior, or even multidirectional. And you can have biceps pathology, slap lesions, and you can have various varying forms of neurological involvement around the shoulder, which is not as rare as what you might be made to think in a normal course of teaching. So again, I would again open up the chat right now. That this is a long time ago. I saw this patient at his home, and immediately something strikes you straight away. Anybody in the chat would like to just comment on what this shoulder is, whether the right is involved or the left is involved? Anybody?
Yes, any resident, please go ahead with the answer.
Right.
You can you can speak also.
Right shoulder is involved.
Okay, what do you see in the right shoulder?
Drooping of shoulder.
So there is a drooping of the shoulder. That's correct. So there is something very clearly and visibly wrong with this particular shoulder. You know, this patient has had multiple previous consultations, but you know why this was missed? Because nobody took his shirt off, right? So it's very, very important that you look at the patient. The moment you are examining the shoulder, you must remove the clothes. Even if it's a female, you have to give them a gown, but you must look at the shoulder with all clothes removed. Okay. So the first thing, as you rightly said, is that there is a drooping of the right shoulder. And as you see here, there is obviously some prominent muscles here, but primarily it is this part which is drooping. Then you look at the back, and again you see that there is something amiss. The shoulder is drooping, but if you see, there is complete loss of contours of this particular shoulder as compared to the opposite side. And when he tries to lift his shoulder, he can only do it to about 80-90 degrees. And then when you see is that there is severe winging of this particular scapula. Okay, and that is the reason why he is not able to lift his shoulder beyond this, because beyond this the scapulothoracic motion comes into picture. But even by this time, the scapula starts to wing, and he cannot take it any further up. This is a passive motion. He is able to, so he's got full passive range of motion. He's holding his arm straight up at 180 degrees, but then you can see that there is a clear-cut winging of this particular scapula. Now, this was a spot diagnosis. This patient had a history of a radical neck dissection done 6 months ago. And since that time, he has lost his ability to raise his shoulder. And this was a case of a post-radical neck dissection, spinal accessory palsy. So when the spinal accessory nerve gets affected and sometimes damaged during the clearance of the neck, you get a complete denervation of your trapezius. Okay, and so this is what it's a straightforward diagnosis. You look at him and you look at the fact that he has a history of of neck surgery and a winging scapula. Unless proved otherwise, it's a spinal accessory lesion leading to a trapezius palsy. So this is how your shoulder can wing. This is due to serratus palsy, and this is due to trapezius palsy. There is a difference in the way it wings. We'll see if we can cover it later, but it's very classical. Look at the shoulder from the front, from the side, and the back. And various times you will be able to just straight away come to the diagnosis. So as you see, this is a very typical winging. You can compare it with this particular diagram here. The trapezius is not functioning, and therefore the serratus pulls it to the other side. Okay, so this is what you can straight away see on inspection itself. Wasting is again something which is very, very marked and prominent around the shoulder girdle, especially if it has been there for a long time. But now here, if you see, there is loss of prominence of the deltoid. The deltoid is wasted. The shoulder seems to be subluxed. He's hardly able to elevate. And if you look at the back, there is severe wasting of the suprascapular, supraspinatus fossa, as well as the infraspinatus. So I would like to again ask you, what comes into your mind the first straight away? He looks a very young guy. Anybody, residents?
Recurrent shoulder dislocation.
Yes, anybody?
Current shoulder dislocation.
Someone has written in comment that palsy of now to serratus anterior.
Oh, that's Bell's palsy. So this is
Yes.
not serratus anterior. There is no actual winging.
Yes.
So that's not the diagnosis, but it's a good try. But I think the Bell's, if it's the palsy, then you're basically talking about a facial nerve, if I'm not mistaken. No, it's not a recurrent shoulder dislocation. There is no dislocation. See, if you look at this, in
Rotator
young
cuff
people with
pathology.
recurrent shoulder dislocation, you do not find this amount of wasting at all. Okay, you have to think beyond. So you have to think that there is a wasting of the supraspinatus, wasting of the infraspinatus, and wasting of the deltoid. Okay, so what this has to be neurological. Okay, so this is basically a upper trunk injury involving the C5 C6 nerve roots, because if you look at it, they have a common nerve supply from the upper trunk, the supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and the deltoid, which are supplied. The deltoid is supplied by the axillary nerve. The supra and the infraspinatus are supplied by the suprascapular nerve. Both of these nerves, they originate from the upper trunk, and so this gentleman had a traumatic upper brachial plexus injury. So just if you inspect and you look at your anatomy, and if you remember that, it's a straightforward diagnosis. Okay, and then you have to look down whether the elbow is involved or not. But if you have this kind of a picture with wasting of the muscles at the back and the deltoid, it cannot be recurrent dislocation, but it has to be a C5 C6 root injury or C5 C6 plexus injury. Okay. Again, now can you see some wasting here? Can somebody tell me what area is wasted?
Supraspinatus, sir.
Supraspinatus, yes, that's one of the things. What about here? Can you see my cursor?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So there is wasting here and wasting here.
Supraspinatus and infraspinatus, sir.
So both supra and infra are involved. Let us say that he is a 50-year-old male. There is no wasting of the deltoid here. What is the most presumptive diagnosis? What is your first differential diagnosis?
Yes, anybody?
Okay, so basically there can be only two pathologies which can give rise to this situation where you have a wasting of the supra, infra, and everything else is okay. So this can happen only in two situations. One is a chronic rotator cuff tear. Okay, so if you have a tear of your supra and infra which has been on for a long time, you will have this significant wasting. Okay, and the second, which is a very unusual diagnosis, so if we see 100 rotator cuff tears a year, we are only going to see 5 cases of the other diagnosis, which I'm going to tell you, is an entrapment of the suprascapular nerve. Okay, has anybody heard of that? Suprascapular nerve entrapment? So just like you have a carpal tunnel syndrome where your median nerve can get compressed in the carpal tunnel, you have your suprascapular nerve, which when it passes through the suprascapular notch, can get compressed. So that is called an idiopathic suprascapular entrapment neuropathy. So as I said, you see 100 cases of rotator cuff tears a year, but you can only see 2, 3, or maybe 5 cases of suprascapular nerve entrapment. So it's not a very common diagnosis. But when you see wasting of both the spinetoid, you have only two situations. One is a chronic tear. It doesn't happen in an acute tear. If somebody has had an acute traumatic situation just 10 days ago, you do not come across this wasting. But you will come across this wasting if somebody has this tear for 6 months. Okay. So again, just by visualization, just by inspection, you're going to be able to make a diagnosis and come down to just two pathologies. Okay. Shrikunj, is that clear?
Yes, sir. Absolutely clear, sir.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Somehow I have some problem in slide progression. Okay. Now coming to the same thing, if you, I'm going to just give you the findings here because it may not be very clear in the picture. But this guy is a very huge built a person. He used to be a boxer in his past, but he presented with isolated infraspinatus wasting. Can you see this area here?
Yes, sir. It's visible.
Is it wonderful? So on this side, he's very muscular. He's the right hand dominant. This side is absolutely fine, but there is a huge amount of wasting here, which is isolated infraspinatus wasting. Okay. So now, if you look at this, rotator cuff tears don't happen like this. So you cannot have an infraspinatus tear, but everything else being intact. Okay, that's just not the way it works. So here again, this is again a nerve pathology. It is a suprascapular entrapment, but only at the spinoglenoid notch. Okay, so this patient has the suprascapular nerve is supplying the supra and the infraspinatus. The supraspinatus is intact, but the infra is wasted. So you must understand that the entrapment is distal to that. Okay, so the entrapment is distal to the supraspinatus. So there is only one diagnosis, and this is called a infraspinatus wasting because of compression at the spinoglenoid notch. So you can be very specific. All you need to do is just examine, just inspect your patient, and the diagnosis pops out straight in front of you. So for this patient, you need to do two things straight away. Get your normal x-rays, which is fine. You need to get an MRI. I'll show you the MRI, what was wrong with this. And you need to get a good EMG NCV study. You need to tell your electrophysiologist that I want to see this. I want to see the suprascapular nerve. Otherwise, you send them for EMG NCV right shoulder, and they will do axillary nerve, and they will do your ulnar, median, and radial nerve. They would not normally even look at a suprascapular neuropathy unless they are told what to see. And that, as orthopedicians and as clinicians, it is our job to tell them that this is what I want to see. Okay. So again, just inspection. You inspect them, and your pathology is clear to you. The next thing that you have to see, especially if you are going to do shoulder surgery, is previous shoulder surgery. So this lady has had multiple shoulder surgeries before, and look at the hypertrophic scars. You need to understand and tell them that, if you have two scars which are hypertrophic, your third scar is going to be even worse. You can have scar-related complications, and you need to even look at this to plan how you're going to put the scars. So this is one thing, but then there are certain scars which will even straight away tell you the diagnosis. Just like the first case I showed you, this lady has this scar in the posterior triangle of the neck, and she presented with scapular winging. She had a trapezius palsy. So you have a scar at the back of your neck, and somebody comes with a shoulder pathology, you have to suspect a trapezius palsy. Okay. Again, you will see if you look for them, you will see them. Okay. So when I was a resident, in first 5, 7, 8 years of my practice as a shoulder surgeon, I never bothered to look for this. But it's only when you go as a surgeon, when you go as as a clinician, you come to look at these things. And I'm sure so many people would have come and I would have missed this. But now you can't do that. The moment you see that there is a scar anywhere around, especially around the neck, and the patient has a shoulder pathology, usually it is a nerve issue. Okay, anybody can tell me what sign this is?
Popeye sign, sir.
It is a Popeye sign, right? What does it suggest?
Biceps tear.
So it actually suggests
Long head of bicep.
LHB, long head of biceps is torn off, and then it retracts down. So that's probably the simplest of signs, but you shouldn't miss it. So it can happen in isolation, but most of the times you have these patients who are in their mid to late 40s, and they come with that, they're very likely to have a concomitant rotator cuff pathology. So the importance of this Popeye sign is not just that he has a rupture of the long head of biceps, but the fact that he can have concomitant rotator cuff pathology, which is much more important and desirable to treat rather than a ruptured long head of the biceps, which apart from this visible deformity, usually does not have any other issues, and you can leave most of these alone. But you must investigate them to make sure that they have a rotator cuff which is normal. Again, very interesting case. A very young 14-year-old boy presents with this kind of a situation. This is a very unusual diagnosis, but can somebody make a guess as to what this might be?
Springle shoulder, sir.
So that is one diagnosis. It is a Sprengel shoulder, but that wasn't the case here because in Sprengel shoulder, one or maybe both shoulders are high riding. Here there is gross winging. So this is again a very unusual and a relatively rare diagnosis. But when you don't need to perform any other test, you just need to see it. This is a case of facioscapulohumeral dystrophy. Okay, in which patients present with bilateral scapular winging. So you need to look at it that it's a symmetrical pathology. It is a bilateral pathology. The patient is an adolescent. When the patient is an adolescent, you can rule out so many things. You can rule out all cuff-related degenerative pathologies. You can rule out most birth injuries because the rest of the neurology is normal. But this is a muscular dystrophy, and they classically present between 12 and 16 years of age. It is very striking. All you need to see is look at them and make your diagnosis. So never forget to look at the scapula. That's one thing which I would like to even say just from the inspection. And again, there are some cases which are very obvious. As you can see, there is a bump here, there is an injury here. So this is a traumatic acromioclavicular dislocation. So just by inspection, a lot of these things can be made. So just to summarize, on inspection, you have wasting of both supra and infra. You have just the wasting of infra, and you have the wasting of deltoid, supra, and infra. And all these can lead you straight to your diagnosis of which nerves can be involved and what further investigations you would want to do. So again, very, very important points of inspection. Look at the patient from all three sides, front, from the side and the back, compare it with the opposite shoulder and come to your diagnosis. Make sure that you have disrobed your patient irrespective of him being a male or a female. Is everything clear so far? I have not taken any tumors, or you can have exhaustosis or something, which is because it's very, very basic, and it would be a part of a general orthopedic examination anyway. So far, Shrikunj, any questions for anybody, just for the sake of inspection?
Yes, anybody has question regarding inspection? Sir, someone has written, sir, please explain bilateral scapular winging again. That last page.
Basically, bilateral winging suggests that there is both bilateral involvement, and there is some sort of instability where the scapula is not stabilized. Now, there are very few scapular muscles which will actually stabilize your scapula and the shoulders, the prime being your serratus anterior and your trapezius. Now, if you have, it's very unusual to have bilateral trauma. So the moment you have bilateral scapular winging, you have to think of very few things. One being the facioscapulohumeral dystrophy, which is what I mentioned, or you can have a cervical involvement where you can have some involvement of both the sides. So it's quite common that it happens in some neurological involvement, viral infections of sometimes they can affect both the nerves. There is a history of fever, there is a history of cough, cold, etc. And you can have this kind of a presentation. So bilateral winging of scapula should immediately suggest that as this pathology is bilateral, most of the times it cannot be traumatic. It can be congenital, which normally presents a little late in life. And most of the times, either it is a situation like this, or it's a cervical spine involvement. Okay?
Yes, sir.
All right. So again, we are going to go through the same process of palpation. So again, the whole idea is to give you some method of palpating so that you don't miss out on certain joints. So as this tip is that you start medially at the level of the sternoclavicular joint and proceed laterally and then end posteriorly at the back. Okay? So you start with palpating the sternoclavicular joint because it's very easy. You just have to go to the sternal notch and palpate it. As I said, sternoclavicular arthritis is not unusual, and sometimes you even see a large swelling around your medial end of the clavicle, which is quite commonly seen in an arthritic sternoclavicular joint. Okay, so you start from that, palpate gradually all the way across the clavicle, and then you reach the acromioclavicular joint. So there you touch it. Again, acromioclavicular joint pathologies are very, very common. You can have acromioclavicular joint arthritis, you can have acromioclavicular joint dislocations, you can have old dislocations, etc. If the patient has even young patients who are doing a lot of gymming, bench pressing, weightlifting, They can all have acromioclavicular joint arthritis at a very young age. In chronic power lifters or weight lifters, you can even have lysis, osteolysis of the distal end of the clavicle. So acromioclavicular joint, very important. Then you go just palpate the subacromial region, just at the anterolateral corner of the acromion, palpate the anterior joint line. So the patient can say that I've got shoulder pain, but then you have to distinguish between whether this is coming from the joint, whether this is coming from the bursa, whether it is referred laterally. Vast majority of subacromial pathology, which could include rotator cuff tears, subacromial impingement, subacromial bursitis, they will all be referred to on the lateral aspect of your shoulder. Okay, for two reasons, your subacromial bursa can extend quite further down, and there is a referred pain because of the axillary distribution. So you look at where the tenderness is, palpate the bicipital groove. I'll show you where the bicipital groove is. Palpate your tuberosities, and then again go at the back and palpate your scapular muscles. The scapulothoracic articulation is a common source of pain, and you can actually, the two most common sites of pain is the superomedial angle of the scapula and the inferior angle of the scapula. Both these areas can have bursa, and you can have scapulothoracic bursitis. You can even have something called a snapping scapula, where you can palpate, and when the person moves the shoulder, you can feel the grating and the noise that the scapula creates when it moves on the rib cage. And it's quite commonly seen in bursitis, or very occasionally you can have some exostotic growth on the chest wall or the scapula, which can give rise to that kind of a grating. So start from the front, go laterally, superiorly, anteriorly, and end at the back. So again, if you can see my marker, can you see my marker, Srikunj?
Yes, sir, we can see, sir.
Okay, so that's the sternoclavicular joint, and then you gradually just trace this all the way out, and here is the acromioclavicular joint. Just going here would be your anterolateral corner of the acromion. It's commonly painful in impingement, or when you have a subacromial spur. This is the area of the coracoid. You have a subcoracoid bursa. You can also have a subcoracoid impingement, and this is where the pain could be a lot of times. And then, joint line pain is very common in osteoarthritis and frozen shoulder. Lateral based pain is very common in subacromial pathologies. Okay. So you can see, note for any swelling, pain, any definite gaping, or gross instability of any region here. So the bicipital groove is somewhere here, corresponding to your long head of the biceps. As you know, the origin of the long head of the biceps is intra-articular, and then it comes down around here, continues down through the bicipital groove. So you can actually locate the bicipital groove. You can actively flex, the patient can flex the elbow, and you can provide supination and external rotation. And in this area, you can just palpate if there is any tenderness. So bicipital tenderness is quite common, and you can have bicipital, you can have tendinosis of the biceps within the groove as well. So this is different from your slap lesions or your labral tears, which are within the joint, but the biceps can have tenosynovitis within the groove itself. Now coming on to the range of motion. Now, if you look at the range of motion, you have what is called the forward flexion, you have abduction, you have external rotation, and you have an internal rotation. The adduction of the shoulder is difficult to measure, but it is something what we call is a cross-arm adduction. Can you see me do that cross-arm adduction? Yeah? So this
Yes,
is
sir,
called
we can see
cross-arm adduction. And we see the range of cross-arm adduction on how far back on the opposite shoulder the patient can go. Normally, in the range of forward flexion can be anywhere between 140 to 180 degrees, depending on the build of the patient. Even the abduction can be that much, especially with palms up and thumbs pointing up in external rotation. External rotation with the arm by the side, usually at 45 degrees. Internal rotation, the way we measure internal rotation of the shoulder is actually hand behind the back. Okay, so you ask the patient to take your arm back. Okay, can you see me doing that, Srikunj?
Yes, sir. We can see
Yes,
you.
sir, we can see, sir.
Right. So that is how you measure internal rotation. you do not measure internal rotation like this on the chest wall. Okay, the internal rotation of the shoulder means hand behind the back, and then you have to measure that, because internal rotation can be restricted in many pathologies, but especially in frozen shoulders. So some people will come and they can hardly reach their trochanters. Some can go to the SI joint, some can go to the sacrum, the lumbar, etc. Normal internal rotation with the thumb up, you should be able to reach the inferior angle of the scapula, which corresponds to about D7. Okay. Now, if you have when you are dominant on one side, and if you check both your arms at the back, if you are right dominant, your right sided internal rotation can be less than that of the left. Okay, all of you can even try it now. Take both your arms at the back, because that is called a physiological restriction because of physiological posterior capsular contractures. So in your dominant extremity, you may have less internal rotation as compared to the opposite side. Okay, have you guys tried it?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We tried. Yes.
Okay, fine. So that is just the forward elevation. Normally we ask the patient to do both sides so that you get an idea about the amount of restriction. Usually you go face up, palm up, so that you have maximum external rotation, forward elevation in a rotated position. Arm by the side is 0 degrees and all the way up is 180 degrees. The same you do with abduction. Okay, and usually abduction, forward flexion, they normally follow each other, and usually once even in a pathology, when one starts recovering, the other also starts recovering. That's the external rotation with arm at the side, elbow flexed to 90 degrees, and you can check the amount of external rotation. So these are the two ways of looking at internal rotation. One is the one which we just discussed, which is like this, and this is a combination of external rotation and abduction. Okay, and you can especially in post-operative patients, you can see that you can compare it to the opposite side, how far at the cervical region or back, upper thoracic, can the shoulder reach. So this is a combination of abduction and external rotation, and this is called the Apley scratch test. So this is one of my patients of a reverse shoulder arthroplasty, and again, she sent me pictures from her home, and we can easily see that she has nearly the same amount of abduction and rotation on both the sides. So it's quite a useful test to compare, especially in daily activities, how far the arm goes in abduction and external rotation. So this is a combined abduction external rotation test. So again, evaluate active range of motion. Lack of full range of motion with active and passive exam is usually found in adhesive capsulitis or arthropathies. Okay, when you have passive range of motion which is more than active, then usually you are looking at a cuff tear or some kind of a neurological involvement. And again, evaluate bilaterally, because you must compare to the other side, which is usually the normal side. So again, this was these are some pictures from the OR. So this patient has a global restriction of motion. She's a very young diabetic. So she has forward elevation to just about 80 or 90. She has, when you look at it, she has an internal rotation contracture. Can you see that? The arm is in internal rotation. So there is no external rotation. The arm is in internal rotation. She can hardly just go at the buttock on this side. So there is severe restriction of internal rotation. And this is called AB, ER and IR. So what I'm trying to do is I abduct the arm to 90 and look for internal rotation and external rotation. When both of them are restricted, it is usually a case of a frozen shoulder. Okay. So this is what is, you look at. So there is a global restriction of motion in a diabetic. Most of the times, unless proved otherwise, this is a frozen shoulder. And the importance of documenting this immediately before surgery is that this is after we do an arthroscopy and release it. This is the kind of motion we get. So instead of an internal rotation contracture, we get about 45 degrees of external rotation. There is full ABER and ABIR, and there is a full forward elevation all the way up. So you can compare what you had before and what you have immediately intraoperatively. Okay?
Yes.
Right. So far so good, Triples?
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Okay.
Anybody has any doubt or question?
Can I just pause share for a moment?
Sure, sir. Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to resume the sharing. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. We can hear you.
Right. So now we come to specific examination of a rotator cuff tear. Okay. Now, as you all know, anatomically, the rotator cuff is a group of muscles. Unlike the name, we all think that they rotate, but they have a very significant function. They are synergistic muscles with your other muscles around the shoulder, and pretty much contribute to almost all the range of motion of the shoulder. So you have the supraspinatus, the infraspinatus, and the teres minor at the back, all attaching on the greater tuberosity. You have the intervening long head of the biceps, which is called the rotator interval, and anterior to that is your subscapularis. Okay, you have the subscap, the supra, the infra, and the teres, and all of them can actually be examined separately in a fairly consistent manner, and clinically you can come to a diagnosis of the type of tear, the extent of tear, and maybe even the chronicity. As I showed you in inspection, long-standing chronic tears will have significant wasting of the supra and the infra, which is the most common rotator cuff tear. Sometimes you have a combination of supra and subscap, which in shoulder language we call it an anterosuperior tear. When you have a tear of supra and infra, we call it a posterosuperior tear. Okay. So if we go for examination, as I just told you, we have already inspected, we have palpated, we are suspecting that this is a rotator cuff tear. So now, again, I think this video might not work. Yeah, it's probably not working, but this is called the Job's test. Okay, what you do is with the patient either in the sitting or the standing position, with you standing in front or at the back, with a scapular plane abduction. Okay, so it's not in front of the body, but it's at about 45 degrees. You ask the patient to put the thumbs down, and both the sides you ask the patient to push up against your hand. Okay, this is called the Job's test, and if there is supraspinatus weakness, the patient on the affected side will not be able to push against your hand with your resistance. The infraspinatus, I'll show you the videos also, and hopefully most of them might run. Now, the supraspinatus is a muscle which is responsible for initiating your abduction and your rotation, but the strength of the rotation comes from the infraspinatus. Okay, so this is how you would check your infraspinatus: by elbows by the side of your body, and you have to ask the patient to push your palm against resistance. Okay, that is how you test the infraspinatus. Okay, now this lady, if you look at this lady just from the picture, on the left normal side, she has full external rotation, but here she is not able to do any external rotation whatsoever. Okay, so this is absolutely straightforward that this patient has a large rotator cuff tear, or she has a neurological involvement where she is not able to do any form of external rotation. So examination of infraspinatus is also, there is also another way of doing it, that by passively bringing the arm out to about 45 degrees, then you ask the patient to push out against your hand. If you, this video may not work, but here as you see, I am pushing this arm from outside and he is not able to resist that. So this is the same patient as I showed you in my inspection with infraspinatus wasting, and he had a significant weakness of the infraspinatus. Okay, so this was not a cuff tear, but this was a neurological involvement leading to significantly weak external rotation. Okay, so he's not able to push my hand out against resistance. Now this is another test. It is called the external rotation lag sign. When this test is positive, you can be sure that there is a large cuff tear which involves the entire infraspinatus. So I'm going to see if this video runs here. Okay, I have another video. We'll see there. Okay. Now this is the examination for teres minor. This is called the Hornblower sign. What is the Hornblower sign? Basically, you take the shoulder to 90 degrees of abduction and external rotation like that, and push. Try to push the forearm in internal rotation. Okay, and the patient has to resist that. If the arm falls, it usually also suggests the involvement of the teres minor. Okay, is that clear, Srikunj?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay. So another easier way of testing is you can ask the patient to raise the arm to the mouth. This means the recruitment of teres minor. So if the teres minor is involved either in a rotator cuff tear or it is paralyzed, the patient has to abduct the arm to reach the hand to the mouth. Okay, so this is like an interpretation of the Hornblower side, that the patient cannot reach to the mouth unless they abduct with the deltoid and bring the hand to the mouth. So this is another way of interpreting that. If the patient cannot bring the hand to the mouth without abducting, this is very likely that the patient has a teres minor involvement, and you can call it a positive Hornblower sign. Okay. Coming on to the subscapularis. Now, as you know, or if you don't, then you can learn right now, that the subscapularis is an internal rotator of the shoulder. Okay. So apart from stabilizing the shoulder, it helps in internal rotation. So basically, to check the subscap, there are two ways of doing that. One is to try to take the hand behind the back and ask the patient to lift the hand off the buttock. Now this is called the Gerber's test. Okay, this was described by a surgeon called Christian Gerber from Switzerland, and it's called the Gerber's lift-off test. You ask the patient to lift, and he or she is not able to lift the hand off the buttock, then this would indicate that there is a subscapularis tear along with or in isolation. Okay, as you see, this is the picture, and this right arm, this lady is not able to lift off her buttock or the lumbar spine. So this is suggestive of a subscapularis tear. Can you see this video?
No, sir.
Can you see
No,
the
sir.
video?
No, sir.
Okay, I'll pass on, I'll skip it. Can you see this video?
No, sir.
And this here?
Yes, sir.
So this on the right side, this is the normal side. I am going to rerun it again. The patient is able to even keep it lifted off, okay? So this is called the modified Gerber sign, where you lift the palm of the buttock and the patient is able to hold it in the air. Were you able to see that in this video? Srikunj?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, so this is a normal subscap, and can you see this picture?
No, sir.
Okay. Fine. Now the next test again for the subscap, as you know, it's an internal rotator. So you can ask the patient to press on the belly with both the hands and get the elbow in front of you. Okay. So this is called a belly press test. And if the patient has a large subscap tear, the patient will not be able to get the elbow in front of the body. Okay. And you can also examine it with both your hands, keep them on the elbow and ask the patient to push your hands, okay, without moving your palm. So if the subscap is intact, the patient should be able to do that quite easily. So as you see, this is a very old woman. She has bilateral massive rotator cuff tears. In fact, she had bilateral cuff tear arthropathies. And as you see, I'm asking her to press the belly and get the elbows in front. This is just a picture, but she's not able to move any of her elbows in front. So basically, she has bilateral massive cuff tears and with the involvement of the subscap. So she's not able to get the elbows in front of the body. So this is called a bilaterally positive belly press test. Okay. So let me just rephrase this. So this patient has a limited forward elevation. He has full external rotation and he has a good strength of external rotation. So this patient is very likely to have just an isolated supraspinatus tear. Okay. Can you see any of the videos here?
Yes, sir. We can see, sir.
Okay. Can you see this video where my cursor is?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I'm going to play it again. So this is the Job's test. He's in quite a bit of pain. This shoulder he can easily elevate against my resistance, but here he is unable to do so. Can you see that? Srikunj,
Yes,
can
sir.
you see?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Can you see this video?
No, sir.
Okay. Can you see this one?
Yes, sir.
So he's got full passive range of motion, but he cannot stabilize his arm. So it falls beyond a certain extent. Can you see this video?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So this is the Job's test. He's not able to move his left arm beyond my resistance. So this patient had intact external rotation, had good strength of external rotation. The subscap was normal, but he could not elevate. There was a positive Job's test, as you can see here in this video. So this is a classical situation. As you see, he's about 45. So early middle-aged patient with an acute history of weightlifting, followed by loss of elevation. So this is a classical isolated supraspinatus tear. So you can actually make your entire clinical diagnosis. Then you may get your ultrasound or your MRI and confirm the diagnosis of the same. Consider this woman. She is able to reach her hand to the mouth. She has no active external rotation. She has no forward elevation because she is trying to lift it herself. She has a positive belly press test. Okay. So this patient has most probably a supra. She is able to reach here. So she has a supra, infra and a subscapularis tear. Okay. So this is a large antero-superior tear extending into the infraspinatus. Okay, so this is how you may be able to clinically diagnose what part of the rotator cuff is torn. So the left is absolutely normal. You have to compare it with the left, and the right is completely flail. Okay, so this is a very large rotator cuff tear. In this lady, again, it is very interesting that she has no external rotation. She has full forward elevation. She has a teres minor involvement as well. And you would think that how does she have a full forward elevation? The reason is she has an intact subscapularis. She has an intact coracoacromial ligament. And therefore, even just if you have this which is intact, then the deltoid can elevate the arm because the humeral head is still stabilized against the glenoid. Okay. So sometimes it is quite interesting to note how the patients are behaving, that in spite of having supra, infra and teres minor involvement, just by having an intact subscapularis, the patient can still have what we call an intact force couple and the patient can elevate the arm. can you see this video?
No, sir.
Shrikant, can you see this?
No, sir.
No, sir.
Can you see the video?
No.
No, sir.
Okay, I'll get the next one. Now, can you see this video?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, what I am doing is I am externally rotating the arm and then leaving it. Okay. Did you see that? It just falls over. Did
Yes,
you see
sir.
that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, what is this? This is called the external rotation lag sign. The patient is not able to keep the arm in external rotation. See that again? So I'm keeping the arm in external rotation. I'm asking the patient to hold it like that. But can you see her refusing that she can't do that? There you go. Did you see that, Srikunj?
Yes, sir.
So is that clear? That's called the external rotation lag sign. Okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And see, this is can you see this video now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So the left is a normal shoulder. She's able to raise it, but the right side has no forward elevation. She has full passive elevation, and then she can keep it at the elevated position and then very gradually bring it down. Did you see that?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so this patient has lack of elevation. There is a lack of external rotation. There is a positive external rotation lag sign. So most likely diagnosis in the presence of intact neurology, which is usually the case, is a large supra-infra cuff tear. Okay? And this is what we did. This was 15 years ago. Right now we do all this arthroscopic. But as you see, I am just going to describe this to you. This is the antero-superior approach. This is the acromion. Can you see that? Srikunj, can you see this
Yes, sir.
acromion?
Yes, sir. Clear.
Okay, and this is a bare greater tuberosity. There is nothing here. There is no rotator cuff here. Okay, and we are bringing it all out. Can you see this? This is the rotator cuff. This is how it looks like in an open surgery. And can you see this?
Yes,
This
sir.
is a repaired rotator cuff. So compare this with this, and you can see that there was no cuff here, but now there is a completely repaired rotator cuff. Is this video running?
Yes, sir.
So can you see the whole arm, the whole shoulder now?
Yes.
Right? So this was the traditional way, the old way of doing a rotator cuff repair is the classic open repair. And you can still do it today. There is absolutely no harm. But we have now moved on to arthroscopy. Okay. So this is how you would look like. It has a full thickness, retracted supra-infra tear. It classically correlates with the clinical findings and the surgery, and you can repair that and get a good result. Now, the other thing which is also quite common is subacromial impingement. Now, there are two ways to diagnose subacromial impingement. One is called the empty can sign. Have you heard the empty can sign?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so you first of all, you ask the patient to elevate the arm to about 90 degrees with the thumb pointing up, which is called a full can, and then you ask them to turn the thumb around to the floor. This is called the empty can. Now, what in essence this is doing is it is internally rotating the shoulder, and if they have a subacromial pathology, could be subacromial bursa, could be a spur, then people can have pain here, and therefore this is called a positive impingement test. This is called the Hawkins test, where you put the arm in this position and you flex the shoulder to 90, and then you do a forced internal rotation. Okay, what this essentially does is bring the entire greater tuberosity under the acromion, and it causes pain because there is impingement there. So this is called the Hawkins test, right? Again, now coming on to the various special tests, but these are specifically for, I'll come to, first of all, let's get back to first instability. Now, if you come across recurrent dislocations, the most common instability is anterior instability or anterior inferior instability. And then you have the apprehension test, the relocation test, and the anterior release test. It is very important that when you are looking at a patient of instability, you must look at ligament laxity. Okay, so this patient has Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Okay, you have heard of Ehlers-Danlos?
Yes, sir.
So it's a connective tissue disorder, but look at his amount of laxity. Okay, so his elbows are lax. There is hyperextension to about 30 degrees on both sides. Look at the way his thumb is moving all the way down here, and I can just push his shoulder in and out. So this patient has severe amount of laxity because of a connective tissue disorder, and these patients are very difficult to treat by just doing your basic labral repairs. So you must look at any patient who comes to you with instability. You must look at few things. You must look at the thumb. You must look at the MCP joints. You must look at the hyperextension at the elbows. And in fact, you can sit the patient and look at hyperextension at the knee also. Okay. So you must define that whether this patient has got severe ligamentous laxity or not. Okay. The next test is called the sulcus sign, where you hold the arm and drag it down and see if there is a space that creates between the acromion and the humeral head. Okay, this is another sign for testing laxity of the connective tissue. Now, the most common test that we do for anterior instability is the anterior shoulder apprehension test. And this is classically done with the patient sitting on a stool. The examiner is at the back of the shoulder. You do abduction to about 90 degrees and start externally rotating. If the patient has anterior instability, most of them will give you a face like this, where they are very apprehensive about the shoulder dislocating. Sometimes they will actually stop you from doing external rotation. Okay, you can further do a provocation by trying to gently push the shoulder from the back towards the front, and most of the times the patient will actually get up and not allow you to complete the test. Okay, so this is what is the positive apprehension sign. The same thing can be done in the supine position like that. You get the patient at the edge of the table and try to do abduction and external rotation, and you look at the patient's face and they'll be very apprehensive about this. Okay, now the relocation test. When you do this, and when the patient is apprehensive, you put your hand in front of the shoulder and actually physically push the shoulder down or the glenohumeral joint down. The patient has a relief of that apprehension, which is also called a positive relocation test. All right. So these are all tests for anterior instability. You can further provoke it by suddenly releasing the hand, and the patient will again complain of apprehension or will jump up. And so these are all, this is the same spectrum of looking at the instability of the patient in one particular direction, okay, which is mainly anterior. But you can also have the same thing for posterior instability, and you can have a posterior test for posterior as well. You can, I'm sorry, I thought there was a slide here, but it's not. But you can do a pivot shift test. You can do a posterior pushing test and see if the patient feels any apprehension at the back. But this is extremely rare because 99% of all dislocations are usually anterior. Okay. Now I'm going to go back to some of the tests here. Right. So these are some special tests for the biceps tendon. They may be positive when you have a slap tear. Do you know what is a slap tear? Anyone?
Yes, anybody? Yes, it's a simple question. Please answer.
Right. So basically, slap tears are also labral tears, but they are superior in location. So SLAP, it stands for superior labral anterior to posterior tears. Okay. So these are the tears which are mainly in the superior portion of the labrum. Sometimes they can involve the long head of the biceps, and they are quite commonly seen in throwing athletes. Okay, so if you have cricketers, badminton players, tennis players, volleyball players, occasionally swimmers, so all those people who have overhead squats basically can have superior labral tears. Okay, they are different from your anterior instability or your posterior instability, where the tears are antero-inferior. So it is from the inferior part of the labrum which gets torn, and it is your anterior glenohumeral, antero-inferior glenohumeral ligament which is disrupted when you have the classical anterior dislocation. So the slab tears are different. Sometimes they form a spectrum of the biceps tendon pathology. And there are a few tests like this. This is called the Speeds test, where you have to actually, you do resisted supination and forward elevation of the patient, and they may refer the pain to the biceps tendon or the bicipital groove. Then it's called a positive Speeds test. It is not a very sensitive or a specific test, but sometimes if it is positive, then it can give you an idea that this patient may have a biceps pathology. Now I showed you that empty can and the full can test. There is another test called the O'Brien's test, and this is one of the tests you can do in your clinical setting for a slap lesion as well. So basically, as you see in this picture, the elbow is extended, the shoulder is 90 degrees. You take it slightly across the arm. First you do resisted forward elevation with the thumb towards the sky, and then you do it with the thumb down. If the patient has more pain or clicks or something with the thumb down position, then it is likely that this patient has a slap tear. Okay, so for all you guys who do not know a slap tear, you might go and read what a slap tear is. But first of all, most clinical signs for slap tears are not very sensitive or specific. Most of the times you have to suspect a slap lesion based on the history of the patient and perhaps on an MRI, but vast majority of the slap tears are diagnosed on an arthroscopy. Is that clear, everyone?
Yes, sir. Clear, sir.
Okay, so slap tears, you must suspect it clinically, but we have very few signs or tests which are very sensitive or specific for a slap lesion. Okay, this is again another test, same for superior labral tear, where you do external and internal rotation, but you sort of compress on the elbow, so it actually compresses the labrum. So again, if positive, it can give you an idea that there is some pathology in the superior labrum. Sometimes there is catching, there is clicking, etc. Okay, we've already gone through this. So we've showed you how to test the rotator cuff. I've showed you most signs for instability, and now, so if you go through your basic schema of things of inspection, palpation, range of motion, and special tests, then these basically come to an end here. But we must also examine what is called a neurological examination around the shoulder. All right. So you must understand that there are these 5-6 situations that you need to look at. You have the suprascapular nerve, which supplies the supraspinatus and the infraspinatus. You have the axillary nerve that supplies the deltoid and the teres minor. You have the spinal accessory, which supplies only one large muscle, the trapezius. You have the long thoracic nerve, which is to the serratus anterior. And then two other situations which are related to the cervical spine. So you have a C5, C6 pathology, and occasionally you have a neuropathic joint. Okay, everybody knows what a neuropathic joint is?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, so you have a Charcot's joint. You must have heard about Charcot, right? And
Yes, sir.
upper limb is very, very commonly involved in what is called syringomyelia. Everybody has heard of syringomyelia?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so if you have a syrinx, then the shoulder can very commonly be involved. So if you have very bizarre presentations in the shoulder, you have bone loss, this, that, you must suspect that there is a syrinx going on here. So never forget that this patient can have a neuropathic joint as well. All right. So neurologically, this is what you have to look at: suprascapular nerve, axillary, spinal accessory, long thoracic, C5, C6, and a neuropathy, syrinx. Okay, so this is quite commonly a situation that you may have these kind of X-rays. This patient has bilateral shoulder rotator cuff tears, which are chronic in nature, but the main symptoms still come from C5-6 radiculopathy. Okay, so sometimes shoulder and cervical spine pathologies can coexist, they can overlap, one can mimic the other thing. So you must pay attention to proper examination also of the cervical spine. You can look at sensations. You can then pinpoint that this probably is from the spine and not from the shoulder, and then decide whether this patient needs further examinations. Because anybody who is over 50, 55, 60, you take cervical spine MRIs, there will always be some degenerative changes, spondylotic changes. Then you have to decide whether I need to do an EMG NCV or not. Okay, so you must examine all these things together and then decide where the symptoms are coming from. Okay, so again, if you look at this patient, he has difficulty in elevation. As I again mentioned, do not forget to look at the back. This is the right shoulder and he has winging of scapula. So this patient had an idiopathic serratus anterior palsy. So if the moment you look at the scapula, you can immediately see whether there is any winging. Sometimes there may not be a nerve pathology, but there is something called scapular dyskinesias. So there is a problem in the rhythm of the scapula. The muscles may not be firing. It is extremely common, again, especially in athletes. I need to make sure that the patient is intact neurologically. So always look at the scapula. So this was another very interesting case. As you see here, this is a very well-built young man. The left shoulder is massively built, but on the right shoulder, there is complete wasting. He's hardly able to elevate to about 90 degrees. But again, as I said in inspection, look at the scars. So this patient had surgery in childhood for cervical lymphadenopathy. And 16 years later, he presents with a chronic trapezius palsy. Let me see. Is this video working?
Sir, this video is working, sir.
Okay, wonderful. So if you look at it, the left shoulder is normal. The right shoulder is winging. Can you see the scapula winging?
Yes, sir.
Right? So this is a normal shoulder. This scapula is completely winged. Is this working?
Yes, sir.
Wonderful. So he is not able to abduct also. This is the normal shoulder, but this scapula is severely unstable. Okay. So this is again a case of a right-sided trapezius palsy for posterior triangle of surgery of the neck. Okay. So you must not have seen any trapezius palsies in your life, but I am showing you 3 of them in just the examination video. So then you have to do some surgeries, so this patient had a trapezius palsy, so you must do some tendon transfers. And once this surgery is done, can you see how his shoulders are back to normal contours?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. And
Yes,
look at that. This was completely drooping, and now it is absolutely normal. Let me see. Can you see this video?
Yes, sir.
So he's able to shrug his shoulders. That is one test for the trapezius, that you have to shrug your shoulders. Can you see that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And can you see this video now?
Yes, sir.
So look at him completely elevate this shoulder. Right? There is no winging. Can you appreciate that?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
So you must come to a conclusion. Only then you will be able to do a complete treatment. This patient was referred to me for a rotator cuff tear. Okay. He was only 24 years old. You cannot expect rotator cuff tears in people who are in their 20s. All right. And see, is this video working?
Yes, sir.
So see how beautifully he is now elevating his shoulders. So again, never forget the nerves. Okay. This was also the same picture in inspection. Isolated infraspinatus weakness and wasting, loss of external rotation. And this is his MRI. You know what is this? This is a cyst. This is called a spinoglenoid cyst. it usually occurs with a posterior labral tear, and the fluid from the joint comes out and compresses over the suprascapular nerve just before it supplies the infraspinatus. Okay, can you appreciate this MRI image?
Yes, sir. It's clear, sir.
Right. So this is your supraspinatus, which is absolutely massive as compared as is his size. This is the cyst, and can you see this infraspinatus?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So that is so much wasted now. There is also wasting, fatty infiltration, etc. That is because of a chronic compression as the nerve comes out right from here. So this diagnosis is a spot diagnosis on clinical examination, and your MRI will help you confirm that diagnosis. So again, as I said, do not forget the nerves. This was another very unusual, interesting case that there was only wasting of the deltoid here. Can you see that the joint is inferiorly subluxed a little bit? Because
Yes, sir.
there is no dynamic stability provided by the deltoid. And this patient has what is called a quadrilateral space syndrome. Okay. So this is an entrapment of the axillary nerve in the quadrilateral space. And we did an open surgery. We released the axillary nerve from the back, and he came back to absolutely normal within 6 weeks. So in conclusion, the local examination of the shoulder is incomplete if you do not examine the nerves. You do not examine complete neurology, you do not examine everything in every patient, but you must suspect, you must make sure that the scapula is not winging, you must make sure there is whatever wasting is there, you must correlate it clinically. So nerve palsies need a very high level of suspicion. Always examine the patient after undressing. Read your previous surgical notes. If the patient has previous surgical notes, read it so you know what might have happened inside. Also regard all pain seriously. Patient can have pain anteriorly, laterally, or even posteriorly, and you must correlate it with the pathology. And eventually, you may need EMG, NCVs, X-rays, or MRIs for accurate diagnosis. Okay? So I'm going to end the presentation here, and we can discuss certain things if you want.
Yes, anybody wants to answer any question regarding shoulder examination, you can please proceed. Sir, there is some new test. Some examiners have asked in last exam. Sir, can you go for bear hug test, sir?
Yes, okay, I'll show you the bear hug test. Okay, I have it here. I'll show you the bear hug test. There are again various interpretations of the bear hug test. The bear hug test is basically done for subscapularis.
Yes, sir.
Okay?
Yes, sir.
And I'll show you the bear hug test. Can you see this picture?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so in the bear hug test, what you do is you put the involved shoulder or the palm of the involved shoulder on your opposite shoulder. Can you see me?
Yes, sir. You are visible.
Now, what the examiner needs to do is try to lift this arm off the shoulder.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay.
And if it is positive, if you can lift the patient's arm, it is usually suggestive of a subscapularis weakness.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so it is a test to be done for subscapularis tears or subscapularis weakness, and this is how it is interpreted. So a positive test is if you can lift it off the other shoulder.
Yes, sir.
So this is by basically putting the arm in internal rotation and then testing the strength. Okay, so
yes,
it is
sir.
like an anterior test, just like the lift-off test. It is a lift-off test done in the anterior position. Are you getting
Yes.
me?
Yes, sir.
So I showed you the Gerber's lift-off test, which is done in the posterior position with the arm at the back and trying to lift the arm off the buttock.
Yes, sir.
Here we do it in the front.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so this is a bear hug test, but just the bear hug by itself, I would not consider it 100% sensitive and specific, but you have to do all the tests. You have to do the belly press test, you have to do the Gerber's test, and
Yes,
you can do the bear hug test. If there is weakness in all the three tests, then you can say for quite in a certain way that this patient will have a subscapularis tear.
Yes, sir.
Isolated subscapulary stairs are very uncommon. Okay, they are not common,
Yes, sir.
but you can still find them. You can still see patients with isolated subscap tears.
Yes, sir.
Sometimes patients can have isolated lesser tuberosity avulsion fractures.
Yeah. Okay,
They
sir.
behave
Yes,
in the same way as a subscap tear.
yes, sir.
Okay,
Yes.
so you
Yes.
have to check all this for a subscapulary stare.
Yes, sir.
Is that clear to the person who has asked this question?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Absolutely clear, sir.
Okay, wonderful.
Yes, sir.
Okay, any more? Anything?
Yes. Any other resident, if you want to ask question, please proceed.
Parag. Parag.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. You're audible, sir.
Yeah. Today, the frozen shoulder, do you use this word again, or you use as a pericapsulitis or something else? Because some of the examiners are little concerned.
Okay, so what you can actually tell is that by the current review by ASES, American Shoulder Elbow Society, and the European Society, there is something called an effort open review. They have all come to the conclusion that the frozen shoulder is the term to be used. Everything else is to be discarded. You have to discard adhesive capsulitis because there are no adhesions in the shoulder when you do an arthroscopy. Okay, there may be some capsulitis, some inflammation that you may see. There is nothing like periarthritis, pericapsulitis, or even adhesive capsulitis. The currently accepted term by American Shoulder and Elbow Society and by the Europeans is a frozen shoulder. Sir, is that clear?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Absolutely clear, sir.
So any resident, if your examiner asks you that, oh, this is an old term, but you say that this is actually the accepted term, and even by an association called ISACOS, that is International Society for Knee and Arthroscopic Surgery, they have all sat together and decided that frozen shoulder is the term to be used.
Yes, sir. Okay, sir.
So you can say that it is a primary or an idiopathic frozen shoulder when you have a normal X-ray with a global restriction of motion, with no other anatomic pathology. You can have diabetes, you can have hypothyroidism, you can have hypercholesterolemia, but these are all clubbed into primary idiopathic frozen shoulder.
Yes, sir.
So if you have a stiff shoulder, but you have arthritis, then you should call it a secondary frozen shoulder, or you could call it anything else. If you have a lock posterior dislocation, you do not have adequate internal rotation, you may say that this is a secondary frozen shoulder. What is it secondary to? It is secondary to a lock posterior dislocation. What is it secondary to? It's secondary to arthritis. It is secondary to avascular necrosis. But these are all diagnoses that you will have to make once you have an X-ray or certain other imaging.
Yes, sir.
Okay, but if you have a global restriction of active and passive range of motion with a normal X-ray, then the term that is currently accepted by most organizations that involve arthroscopy or shoulder surgery is frozen shoulder.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Pachari sir, is that okay?
Yeah.
Perfect.
This is
And Parag sir, one more question, sir.
Yes.
Sir, one or two examiners has asked in last exam the typical anatomical landmark of shoulder joint.
Sorry?
Anatomical landmark means some student answered that sir, shoulder joint is tender. So they asked directly to that student at which point you are going to palpate for shoulder joint.
So you have to say that. So you have to change the way you ask answer. You have to say that the glenohumeral joint line is non-tender.
Okay, sir.
Okay, so I showed you where you have to palpate the glenohumeral joint line. So basically, it is anterior in front of your shoulder in an externally rotated position. So you palpate your shoulder here, and this is where it is the joint line pain.
Okay.
Okay, can you see me?
Yes, sir. We can see it.
So I think instead of saying that there is a shoulder joint pain, it's a vague terminology. That's what I said. You must put the location. So you must say that on examination, I found that the sternoclavicular joint is non-tender, the acromioclavicular joint is non-tender, there seems
Yes.
to be some anterior joint line tenderness which may correspond to the glenohumeral joint anteriorly, right?
Yes, sir.
You can say
Yes.
that the patient is pointing towards the AC joint which is tender, or you can say that the patient has tenderness at the anterolateral corner of the acromion.
Yes,
Can you
sir.
see me here?
Yes, sir. I can see
So
you.
that
Yes,
is
sir.
anterolateral corner. This is usually in either in cuff tears occasionally or in impingement. You can have anterolateral corner tenderness,
Yes, sir.
or you can have an anterior tenderness. You can see, as I said, you can say that the patient has bicipital tenderness in the bicipital groove, etc.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Parag, have you got a very specific point how in the hip is a mid-inguinal 1.2 centimeter down? That is, the examiners are really funny sometimes. So is it possible to give them an idea where exactly anterior joint line is in relation?
So, I mean, see, no, sir. I don't think we can give an absolute landmark for anterior joint line pain, but it is a pain which is just lateral to the coracoid process.
Yeah, that is what I best is to tell them that is just lateral to the coracoid process and just in front of that. That
Yes,
probably the joint
So you
line.
can probably say that the
Yes,
tenderness
yes.
which is just lateral to the coracoid process corresponding to the anterior joint line.
Because hip
Yes, sir.
so particular, I don't know how we are able to palpate also. I don't know. It's such a deep structure.
It is. It is.
Yeah, yeah. But the examiners are sometimes funny, so they will have to answer in that way, you know.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Any other resident want to ask a question? Please proceed.
That's okay, Srikunj.
Okay, okay. Parag sir, the lecture was in very detail and you described in very brief. Thank you very much, sir, for your time and effort, sir.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very
Bye,
much.
everyone. Pachore sir, thank you so much. And
Not at all.
everyone have a good night.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Thank you. Good night, sir. Good night.
Thank you, sir.
Good night.
Good night, sir.
Good night, sir.